Our moral compass in the 21st century is a 21st century moral compass, and it's changed. It changes by the century. It changes by the decade. I call it the shifting moral zeitgeist. 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 And the shifting moral zeitgeist has nothing to do with religion.
Sie wird es saufen in ihrem eigenen Blut!
You can find the occasional verse in Scripture which accords with our modern morality. But you have to do that by sifting through and throwing out large numbers of verses which go against our modern moral compass. So
when you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say there is the reason this is good is because it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement?
But my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past, and I suppose...
So therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution.
Well, you could say that, but it doesn't in any case. Nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural.
Okay, but ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
you could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
You could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
You could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
Why not just take the modern moral compass as it is, having been worked out by moral philosophers and by the sort of discourse that takes place all the time as the centuries go by. We regard with abhorrence slavery, whereas a couple of hundred years ago it was the norm. All sorts of things like that have changed, and this has nothing to do with religion. The other way in which religion might give a moral compass is if people behave in a moral way because they're frightened of God, because they want to go to heaven or don't want to go to hell. And that's a rather ignoble reason for being good. I'd rather meet somebody who is good for the sake of being good rather than for the sake of sucking up to an imaginary friend. Don't get your moral compass from religion. If you did, you'd be stoning adulteresses to death, and you'd be executing people for breaking the Sabbath and for making graven images and that kind of thing.
You'd be stoning adulteresses to death, and you'd be executing people for breaking the Sabbath and for making graven images and that kind of thing.
Right, what is wrong, who's to say, really, in the end? I mean, because it is unknowable.
There's an imaginary line out there between right and wrong, good and evil.
I recently heard a discussion between atheists and the Christian, and it really struck me that the atheist, even though they thought they did, they really did not seem to know the first thing about the Bible, and I mean the most basic of basics. Well, okay, maybe they're just not aware. I mean, ignorance is exactly what it is. It's just lacking knowledge. So maybe they're just lacking knowledge, and a little information would help them understand the position better. And maybe they've just never been exposed to the facts. So regardless, I just want to generally discuss some of the issues that they really seem to have a lot of trouble dealing with. And it was topics basically focused upon why it is that a Christian 2,000 years after Christ does not stone people for breaking the Sabbath laws. And, you know, those kind of things we probably all heard quite a bit. Why don't the Christians keep the Old Testament laws? And, of course, as soon as the Christian points out that the Old Testament laws have been fulfilled, then the atheist asks, well, what about the Ten Commandments? Don't you keep the Ten Commandments? And so that was part of the issue as well. So on the most basic of levels, there is a reason why Christian theology holds to an Old Testament or Old Covenant and a New Testament or New Covenant. And that is because the Old has been fulfilled and the new one revealed. So, to begin with, in the Old Testament, yes, there were 10 primary commandments, but altogether there were 613. Now, this did not mean that an individual person had to keep 613 commandments. And that's because some of the commandments were just for males, some were just for females, some were just for kings, some were just for soldiers, some were just for priests. And so it really depends. But the point is that what occurred is after the Exodus from Egypt, and I always find it quite fascinating that sometimes atheists will complain about the death of the firstborn in Egypt. They never seem to complain about the hundreds of years of slavery imposed by the Egyptians upon the Hebrews. They never seem bothered by that whatsoever. I've yet to hear a single atheist of any rank, anywhere, at any time or any place, condemning the ancient Egyptians for slavery. And of course, if they did, just as in the case of them condemning the death of the firstborn, upon what bases, upon what ethical premise do they pass such condemnations? I mean, hey, survival of the fittest, they struggled to survive, one side lost, one side won. It's evolution, baby, right? Well, so another point that comes up is after the Exodus, Moses is given the 10 Commandments, one of them which is not to murder. It's not to kill, by the way, okay? It's not to murder. Killing would be the unjustified taking of an innocent life. I'm sorry, that would be murder. The unjustified taking of an innocent life. Killing is different. Killing is justified, such as during war, a just war, or self-defense, or some such circumstance. Capital punishment, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. There is that logical and ethical distinction between killing and murder. So anyhow, many, and this may have been popularized in modern times more than anybody else by Christopher Hitchens, ask questions such as, do you really believe that murder was not unethical before Moses received the 10 Commandments? Now that question is rather strange. Why would anybody, why would any Jew or Christian suppose that? Why would they suppose that murder was, there was nothing wrong with it, in other words, until Moses received the 10 Commandments? To begin with, the Bible story of Cain and Abel has Cain murdering Abel, and that was certainly an act which was condemned. And Cain was afraid that other people would come after him to seek revenge. What other people? Well, Adam and Eve lived hundreds of years, and by the time that situation happened, there could have been plenty of people around. In fact, there's one single chapter in Genesis where some 7 generations pass. Just, the chapter's just being succinct. Or think about Moses himself. He fled from Egypt because he murdered an Egyptian. Of course murder was immoral or unethical. Of course it was condemned. And this is because God has written his laws in our hearts. So ethics have always been the same. And you can watch my video called Is Morality Relative to get into these definitions of ethics and morals. Now, think about what if a brand new country was established this very day. So they set out to write a form of a constitution and their laws. And in those laws and constitution, they elucidate the fact that they consider murder to be punishable, unjust, illegal. Okay? Would you really go to that country, those leaders today, and say, "What? Are you not aware that that's already a law elsewhere? What, do you think you're inventing the idea that murder is wrong?" No, of course not. They're just affirming the fact that in their country, this will be the law. And that's exactly what's happening with Moses and the 10 Commandments. The Exodus denotes a people group having to be built up into a nation literally from the ground up. These are people who were slaves, whose parents were slaves and grandparents were slaves. And suddenly they have freedom. Well, the Lord has to literally build them up as a nation from the bottom up. And part of that process is to give them basic laws. The very first commandment is the premise upon which all the laws are based, which is that the Lord freed them from Egypt, and they're to have no other God before him. And now that's interesting because it gets us back to the issue of atheist arguments. And some claim that the first commandment is not even a moral law. And that's because they will say such a thing because atheists are unfortunately way too used to raining down brimstone and fire. They're used to passing out condemnation, moral condemnation, without a premise. They're just used to that. So when they see it in the Bible, it's like they don't even recognize it. They don't recognize the fact that the very first commandment is the premise upon which all the laws are based. So that's what the 10 Commandments are. They're the basic guidelines for the Hebrews. There's no such thing in the Bible as a claim that murder being illegal and unethical and wrong and evil, whatever you want to call it, is some sort of brand new revelation. In fact, it's the very opposite. As I said, there's examples of murder occurring in the Bible before those were given, and it's condemnatory. So secondly, what about the rest of the laws? Well, the Lord had the Hebrew people, whom he was building into a nation, and he declared the various laws to them, not just the 10, but the various, the 613. And the Hebrew people as a nation accepted them. They accepted that they would live according to these laws. These specific laws, particularly the dietary, the ritualistic laws, all of these laws were for the Hebrew people living in a particular time, in a particular place. And that's something else that the atheists complained about in this discussion I'm referring to. Well, isn't God eternal? Aren't God's declarations eternal, relevant to all people, in all places, in all times? Well, that's an assertion. That's just an unfounded premise. That's all it is. Yes, God is eternal, but there's no logical reason why God can't give certain laws at certain times. It's just a pure assertion. That's all it is. So, if you were a Hebrew living in Israel under what I call God's theocratic, monarchically administered kingdom, then you were subject to these certain laws. For instance, the law about not suffering a witch to live, okay? If you wanted to be a witch, you could have been a witch. You just couldn't do it in Israel. These were Israeli laws. You could have gone elsewhere to be a witch, but there were certain laws in Israel. That was one of them. You could not practice witchcraft. And again, if you want to condemn that as an atheist, first, you have to provide an ethical premise upon which to base that condemnation. Just saying that you personally have decided to not like it, and that personal preference is premised upon a personal preference, which is premised upon a personal preference, until we get to a bottomless pit of your personal preferences, no, that's just not good enough. Your personal opinions do not make for an ethical premise. And so, when Jesus came, he stated that he had not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. Aha, said the atheist in this discussion. That obviously means that he and we are supposed to keep all of them, to fulfill them, right? Well, that is certainly not the case. Because, for example, when you think about when Jesus was dying as he was crucified, and yes, it would be nice to hear an atheist condemn the Romans for murdering an innocent man, but I haven't heard that either. Jesus stated tetelestai, which is a very technical word, which means something to the likes of paid in full, often translated as it is finished. And so Jesus came, he did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And when did he ultimately completely fulfill? When he said tetelestai, paid in full. It is finished. It has been fulfilled. So now we have a new covenant, a covenant of grace. But what about the Ten Commandments? Yes, what about them? Well, when Jesus was specifically asked about the commandments, he stated that they are all premised, or that they all revolve around, I should rather say, loving God and loving our neighbor. And Christians still make reference to the Ten Commandments because these are still the most basic guidelines whereby to live in a godly society. That's why you get into these issues of not having to keep ritualistic style Ten Commandments. And as it turns out, here's the way I would put it. The spirit of the law is the parchment upon which the letter of the law is written. Because when it was complained to Jesus that his disciples were out picking grains during the Sabbath, which was not legal, according to the scribes and Pharisees, for them to be doing. And if you read the Old Testament, it most certainly seems like, no, that was definitely not legal for them to be doing on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus explains that Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Sabbath serves man. Man does not serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath gives man a day of rest. Man is not in service of the Sabbath. And Jesus points out that when David and his men were hungry, they went to the temple and they ate the showbread, the bread which was not there for them to be eating. But guess what? They were hungry and they ate it. You see? The law was to serve man, not man to serve the law. And so these are really very basic things that are sometimes really confused and bypassed or misunderstood. The laws of the Hebrews were given to them and accepted by them. They were fulfilled by Jesus and left as guidelines. For instance, the New Testament says that what has been written for our learning. Not to entrap us, not to keep us in eternal ritual cycles, but for our learning. And so these are some of the things that Christians and atheists should just really understand at their very basic level before getting into these odd discussions where atheists in this here day and time really think that, boy, they figured it out. Christians have just been misunderstanding the entire Bible for 2 millennia. But the modern day atheists, boy, they got it figured out. Christians don't understand the system of the Old Testament being fulfilled and the New Testament being revealed. No. Christians have gotten that wrong for 2 millennia. And boy, the atheists, they're here to set us straight, all right. But again, I'm just saying that with a little emphasis to make a point. Because maybe they just haven't thought about it in these terms. Maybe they just haven't read the Bible through. I really don't know. I just know that there seems to be a lot of confusion out there. And I hope these basic things will help elucidate the matter.